the Old Sword Club. Well, this is not our weekly live stream. This is our extra weekly live stream. Anyway, today I'm being joined by Richard Emmerick, and we're going to be talking about how fencing changed in the 20th century. So for those who don't know me, I'm Tim. I'm the regular sort of instructor at the Old Sword Club and event organizer, I guess, person who does stuff. Whereas Richard has been fencing since, I think, was the early 60s, like 1962 you started. And then you even came second in the National Fall Championships, which is pretty cool. And then, in 1974, you started the fencing club in Blacksland High School, and have been running, from what I gather, running fencing club up the mountains pretty much consistently since, which is really, really cool. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Tim. Glad to be here.
It's good to have you. All right, so we're looking at the 20th century, which is, at least in the history of sword fighting, is probably one of the more neglected periods. So what are the big things that what do you think are sort of the big things that changed over the course of the 20th century that have affected how fencing is developed? Oh, before I forget, because I almost did, if you have any questions for Richard or for me or for both of us, or probably actually for Richard, just chuck them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, so you're saying, what are the big changes do you think that happened in the 20th century that have affected fencing?
Well, there's been an awful lot. In fact, when I was sort of going through notes and looking at it, I realised I've really got to just skip the surface, because anything deeper, I would be here for another week or so. I think that there's been a number of very large changes that have taken place. I think, firstly, there's one that's the attitude, and that is that fencing is a game. It's not for dueling. Certainly, there's been duels fought in Australia. There's certainly one in Centennial Park in 1911. And I think Paul Kurtica in his last talk spoke to you about dueling training in Hungary.
Poland.
In Holland. Wrong one. Sorry.
Poland. Yeah.
And there was certainly an element of that in some clubs up until, basically just post-war. Particularly, I'm thinking of the Swords Club with Frank Stewart. He was still talking about epee as small sword. That definition probably gives you an idea of his attitude towards it. So that is probably the biggest change that there has been. But when you start looking at the sport rather than the weapon itself, the changes that I guess that are really big have been, technology has been a major driver, and the way things have changed in blade designs, grip designs, the scoring, the close. That's all been had an effect upon it. Sports science to a certain extent has. Culture, of course, is the big one, that we've actually allowed women to fence.
Big change in a lot of sports in the 20th century, but
yes. In some respects, fencing did lead the way. If you look back into early records, even Swords Club stuff, which started in 1913 by Frank Stewart, there was a women's swords club, and there was a lot of people fencing then right up until the 1930s. But of course, they weren't included in things like Olympics. You couldn't do that.
Yeah, also, I guess looking at it from a 19th century perspective, there's always been always been women fencers on the periphery. I think even the earliest European fencing manual we have, Royal Armoury's manuscript, it's either I-33 or 133, whether or not you interpret the I as a Roman numeral. But that's it. Even one of the people that even depicts a woman fencing, a woman named Walpurgis. So it's kind of this interesting thing that's always there's always been women sort of on the periphery of the hobby, but it's not really until the 20th century that you kind of see women in formal competitions and things like that.
In numbers, yes, there was some demonstration fences or prize fences, you wish to call them that, in the 1880s and 1890s, but not real involvement until the 20th century.
Yeah, not to sort of wide scale involvement. Yeah, no, it's sort of, I guess, kind of interesting how that sort of that cultural kind of impact, all that big kind of cultural impact has changed. I wonder with that as well, in terms of sort of the big kind of pressures on how a sport develops, how much do you think the Olympics has affected things? Like, like fencing is, I mean, that seems to be sort of the biggest event for sports fencing.
Well, World Championships are considered a harder competition than the Olympics. So a title in the
Wow.
World Championships is considered better. We look at it this way. In Olympics, you're only allowed a certain number from each country. And so, say, well, the old days, France would have been number one. So they might have had the top 6 fencers in the world. No, the top 3 were allowed to fence. So for that reason, the World Championships, when they could all go win it, was much harder.
Okay, yeah. So it's sort of so the internally, the culture of kind of, I guess, sports fencing is much more focused on those World Championships and those kinds of competitions. Okay, so do you think there's just having that? Do you think even just having that focus on competition has been a big driver for change?
Well, certainly where change has originated from. The clubs that obviously follow through on what the current status of coaching or competitions is. So yes, in that respect, people are looking at that to a certain extent. So if you look at the last Olympics, for instance, of several weeks ago, and you look at the style of fencing that's being used now, it's totally different to if you go back to, say, 2012 in London.
Oh,
you can see a difference.
You can see a difference in just in the space of 10 years.
Yeah, coaches keep changing things around depending on how referees start interpreting the rules and what's been done with the equipment, which is one of the things I had listed here, of course, is the fact that they keep changing things around with tip retention time and the cutout times, and that changes tactics that you have to use.
Okay, so first off, just what are tip retention times and cutout times? There's going to be a bunch of people watching this who have backgrounds in HEMA who maybe don't know all of the technical terms of Olympic fencing. Just
fair enough.
Yeah.
My fault. I thought that might happen, but I didn't write it down. Okay.
Oh, no, tip retention.
Tip retention in foil has to do with the amount of time the tip must be depressed on the valid target area for the scoring equipment to register the hit. And for instance, at one stage was 124 milliseconds, and they changed it to 127. That doesn't sound like a big change, but it completely changed tactics for a lot of people because they were using what you people would use, the flick attack, where you're actually flicking the blade like a whip. And the idea is it's going to curl around everything, hit the target area, and ring. But with that slight increase in retention time, it doesn't work.
So you got to. I mean, that's really interesting. An entire technique is basically has just stopped working. Because when I was thinking about the differences between modern sports fencing, modern sports fencing and just not 19th century fencing, so stuff I do is there's no flick, there's just no flick attack, or no flick attack in foil. They're in single stick, which is not practicing Olympics. Apparently, because apparently the sticks would bend around parries, or at least people used to complain they did. But yeah, that's really interesting. So changing that time has completely eliminated a technique. And you see
it around,
I beg your pardon, sorry?
Yes, you can still do a flick, but you have to be much more careful about how long it's going to be left on the target. So the way you do it is going to be changed. And you can't use the same extent you used to.
Okay, wow. And do you find that has knock-on effects? If a flick is when people change how they flick, does that then change how people have to defend?
Yes. Well, even the introduction of the flick caused people's changes in how you had to defend it. So yeah, the technical changes all the time, but how far you want to go into that with HEMA people, I don't know, because they might not appreciate what we were doing.
I figure if you're getting into serious arguments about technique changes, then you've either got a very, very comfortable life or a very uncomfortable life that you're ignoring. So yeah, no, but I guess I find it interesting because when we look at the historical record that we have, we see, you can see changes usually over a much bigger period. Although that's that's pretty normal in history. As things change a lot quicker with quicker communications now. But yeah, I find it really interesting to sort of see what's kind of driving that change. Okay, so you said like just changing the compression times has changed what attacks people can use. What are some other things that have basically, or technological changes that have led to stylistic changes?
Well, the other one I just mentioned was the lockout time. That is, again, in foil and in sabre, that is the time that 2 hits will register. So you make an attack, normally the electric light comes up. If they come close together, then both come up. So what they've done is they've played with the time you're allowed between the 2 hits to allow the second hit to register or not.
Okay.
So back in 2004, just after 2004, there was a change in those times, and it meant that foil became almost like epee, because if you get hit in, irrespective of priority, because of the lockout times, you'd get the hit. Fortunately, that got changed sometime after that would as well. It didn't last terribly long, but it caused a lot of angst and a lot of trouble for people while it was on. So it changed the whole style of foil fencing. I
imagine there's there's probably a bit of jockeying as well, depending on which countries, which clubs would benefit from which rule sets. I mean, you see that's something you see. Well, I guess my main point of comparison is actually unarmed martial arts. In terms of one sport, I've done a lot of that. And in kickboxing, there's a dozen different sort of kickboxing rules, and depending on which and depending on who which club sets up a competition, they'll change the rules, or they'll have the rules that are going to sort of favour their club, and then you get things like Olympic Taekwondo, where the those rules change so much to favour Taekwondo as a style that they end up having to do creating their own sport, which was kind of interesting. Seriously, it's but yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So you've got the lockout times, and with that, what kinds of things, what's kind of driving? One thing actually I'm very curious about is what's driving that kind of change. Because in HEMA we have long discussions about rule sets, and we have not just the debate around doubles, so basically the equivalent of wondering about lockout times, but there's also the afterblow. It's how long after you hit someone is it reasonable to assume, is it reasonable for you to have to defend yourself? But in HEMA that's always driven by the desire for a simulation. So the afterblow rule comes from the idea that, just because you've hit someone with a sword, they're not going to be dead straight away, and so they're still a threat to you. And so you shouldn't consider yourself safe until someone would have actually been injured enough to not fight. Whereas I get the impression that's not the case in sport fencing. Is that so? What do you think is actually driving those rules changes?
Politics. That one country has been too successful with technique, so let's see what we can do. That certainly causes some changes in the way they go. I think with lockout times, and also with the retention times, is probably the truth of the matter there. In fact, I know some international coaches have quite openly stated that.
Yeah.
In terms of the flick, it was the Italians were doing too well, and something had to be done to stop them, so they changed it.
They changed the rule. Yeah, so it's
probably just like any bureaucracy. This is what happens. Politics come into play, or if you're changes in, for instance, in mask design and the fixtures on those. If you look at the reason for that, it seems to be the main reason was that the FIE, that is the International Fencing Body, got upset with Leon Paul, who'd brought out a new mask. So they changed their requirements around, so they had to modify their mask.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So that's the sort of thing that does go on. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it happens.
Oh, yeah. That happens. That happens in everything. I mean, personally, I think it's better to be honest about it than pretend that it doesn't. And I was reading, I'll post it to the event. There's this wonderful article that's talking about a lot of sort of the assumptions that a lot of people in like the HEMA and classical fencing communities have about historical fencing, and saying, yeah, but about how it was more noble and more honorable back in the day, and they're just like, no, like people, there was a lot of that, and even down to like, fencers would actually boast like, well, that it was well known that the fencer with the better reputation was more likely to win if the judges couldn't tell what was going on.
Yeah.
So you'd boast, you try and boost your reputation as much as possible, which I guess is kind of
yes, the old steam fencing was exactly the same before the electronic was introduced. And if you could influence the judges, well and good.
Yeah. It's like the old hacking thing, the biggest weakness in any kind of system is the user. So if you can influence that.
Yes.
Cool. So we do have some questions. I might quickly pop up before asking more of mine. So Wolfgang wants to know, does epee also have a retention time in addition to pressure?
No, it's got a lockout time, but it hasn't got a retention time.
Okay, so
and that lockout time has been the same since Adam was a boy, 1/25 of a second.
Okay, yeah, wow. So just really kind of quite small margins. Okay.
It's amazing how you can judge it after a while.
Yeah, well, that was a bit like, that's always been a big thing where it's like, how do you, something as quick as like foil and epee, are very difficult to judge by sight.
Yes, I'll say. When I did my level 2 exam, one of the things I had to do was study a particular fencer and explain what was going on. And the one I got stuck with was Oki Yuta from Japan, who'd come second in the Olympics in 2004. And I was trying to look out where his hits were landing. This is where his hits were landing on the chest. He was so fast with one hit that he actually managed to do it in between frames.
Oh, wow.
That's quick.
That is insanely quick. Yeah, fuck. No, it's a thing. It's like something like when I watch the Olympic fencing, I try and find people who've put it up on YouTube who've actually slowed the footage down so I can see what's going on.
Yeah, well, with that one, I had slowed the footage down as far as I could get it. That's how I found it was between frames. It was unreal. I wish I could have done that.
Yeah, God, see, very like super athletic people and super athletic people, and also like really, really light weapons.
Oh yeah, it's quite funny. The FIE rules on weapons weight. You look at them. I think a foil's limited to a weight of 500 grams. I think if you chest wire foil, which I did in the Sydney Olympics, we were working in the armory there. The average weapon weight was just under 200. So, why would you want a heavy weapon? You don't need it.
Yeah. Well, you're trying to touch, and that. I imagine that has a huge impact as well on the fencing. Because when I use like this thing, which is this is about 650 grams, which is at the lighter end of it, like 19th century sabers. It handles incredibly different, like a modern saber, saber design. So is that actually something that you've seen? I'll get back to Wolfgang's question in a sec, but is that something you've seen as like material technologies improved and stuff, that you're getting like these really, really light, quick weapons, and that's changing things?
Oh yeah, well yes, it just along with sports science training techniques, it's just increased people's physical ability and speed. I mean, guards now, I don't know if you've got them or not, they're made from titanium. They're very strong and they're very light. And the grips, they tend to be aluminium, but they're pretty light. So it depends. If you're old-fashioned and you like something like a French grip with a pommel on the end of it, they're a bit heavier, but you get a better balance. So you're trading one off against the others to what you want.
Okay, so it's actually it's not just it's not like people are always driving for the lightest weapon. Like there's actually a bit of there are some people like, no, I want something a bit that's heavier and got a bit more presence, and then there are other people who are like, no, I want the lightest thing possible.
Some people will change their weapons depending on who they're fencing if they know them. So they might be using a light weapon. This blade's pretty heavy. I'll get out my heavier blade, and instead they'll bring out a heavier weapon, give themselves a bit more support. But you really don't need to, because when you consider everything in the point weapons, you're not blocking an attack, you're deflecting it. And you don't need strength, as you might do with your saber, where you've actually got to block the cut coming through. It's a bit different.
Yeah, well, I found myself, strength is not, it's not so much about strength, it's not so much about strength as about structure, but where strength helps me in what I do is more in terms of like explosiveness, in terms of like being able to lunge faster and
yes,
and longer. Which I guess goes back to sort of the sports science thing. So you talked about sports science. What are, just quickly, like, what are sort of the summaries of what's actually happened with sports science in the 20th century? Like,
quite a bit, one way or another, surprisingly enough. Sorry, just turning my pages. I've got my notes in front of me. There's a few things they've come up with. Stance, for starters. We always use the classic on guard position with the unarmed hand above the shoulder. And of course, sports science very quickly pointed out that what that does is just tightens you up across both shoulders and can actually slow your weapon hand down. So now the preferred stance is having the hand below the shoulder height. The other thing, sort of, is stance. I mean, the width of your stance in your on guard position. As you know, the wider the stance, the more solid the base, but the shorter your lunge. And so what we look for is the optimal distance you can put in to get both. But if you look at the last Olympics, it doesn't seem to have worked terribly well, because there's a huge differences in stances from right through the different weapons. So I think it's what you're happy with as much as anything else. So they did a bit there. They've done other stuff. They've done a lot of research into fitness programs. And with some interesting changes. I mean, we used to always say, gee, you've got to stretch before you fence. But it was immediately pointed out, if you start stretching before you warm up, you're more likely to do yourself an injury than do something worthwhile. So then it became, well, you should stretch after you, as a warm down after you fence, which you try and teach your fencers to do. But you know what? Your game is probably the same. You lose a bout, you're so disgusted with yourself, you throw your stuff in your bag, you sit down in the corner and say, well, you go home. You do not warm down. The other one, and I found this out only a little while ago, which is quite an intriguing one, had to do with water. Oh, you should always drink water and drink water and drink water. Research shows that's a load of garbage. You drink when you're thirsty.
Oh, wow.
But the other one, this was from Professor of Sports Science at CSU Bathurst, he was the guy who started some of this stuff. And he's talking about ice baths. Now, he invented the ice bath stuff, so he knows a bit about it. And he said what you used it for was, in particular, long-range running events. You cool the body down before you start, so that you don't build up excess heat as you're going. Will certainly reduce it. And he said he doesn't know how it morphed into being an after-sport treatment, because his research has shown that it actually achieves nothing.
Oh, because I thought that was like an injury prevention thing. Like you, like in combat sports and also ice hockey, they throw people into like ice baths after as a way of minimizing like bruising and stuff.
In rugby league, in the rugby union and in fencing, he says he has no idea where it came from. There's no research that supports it whatsoever.
Wow. So actually, that's interesting. So you're not just getting actual like science coming in. You're also getting like sort of all those sport myths and stuff where people are like, don't eat this, or don't do that because it'll, whatever the myth of the week is.
Sports drinks. There's the other myth for you.
Really? Just they don't.
The best thing you can have if when you're feeling thirsty from fencing or your competition is water. It's only if you've been swimming a great deal and you're losing body salts and minerals that you should go for one of those sports drinks. But you probably need to take 3 or 4 bottles of water before you even consider taking one of those sports drinks.
Oh, wow.
It's also cheaper.
Yeah. Yeah, no, orders a lot more accessible. Wow, that's yeah, that I didn't know. I mean, when I was young, I was in, I would have been in year six. I was running a cross country event, and I decided the best thing to do was to have a bright red sports drink right before I started. And I actually got got a stitch and just like couldn't run. Got to the point where I couldn't run after only would have been only a few hundred meters.
Mm.
And yeah, and I've never actually touched a sports drinks after that. But yeah, I sometimes I have weird reactions to things. But yeah, like that's really interesting. So it's sort of okay. So it's mostly like just drink water, drink when you're thirsty, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, you don't have to drink X number of litres a day. You just need to drink when you're thirsty.
Yeah.
Very simple and straightforward, that one.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good news, because for anyone who's anyone who's had to run to the toilet whilst wearing leg armor and a groin protection. That's yeah. It's always
So the myths that go around, you just got to be careful of them, and that's one respect where sports science really has helped. Probably the other thing. Sorry.
Oh yeah, just saying. Yeah, so it's actually the sports science actually dispelling a lot of the myths as well.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that's gone on well, of course, is psychology. Getting the mindset right for competitions, and as you know, it varies with each competitor. So there's no set rules on what you should do, but getting it right for each person that's going to fence is a big part of a coach's job these days.
Okay, well, yeah, because I mean, like I hear about that a lot in professional sport, like pro fighters and stuff. People who box or do mixed martial arts and stuff. They talk about the psychology game a lot. So yeah, that's a thing. So that's like a big thing in fencing as well. Is you go and you've got your coach basically doing whatever to keep you in the zone.
Well, yes, can be quite difficult to sort out for each person what you need. But once you've got that going for your students that are really your competitors, then it's certainly worthwhile doing. The other things they've done, some of them are crazy stuff. I mean, particularly in the Asian countries, coaches need to have a certain number of academic papers published to get their names up. You know the game, without me saying any more on that, I would imagine. But for those who don't, you need publications up there to show what a great person you are and how smart you are, so you get a better position in life and hopefully get promoted. And because of that, we've got all sorts of papers that have come out. If you ever want to go to Google Scholar and check through them, you'll find some interesting stuff there. Anything from reaction times of fences, coordination of hand-eye, psychology, various fitness stuff, injuries, most common injuries for fencers. Everyone thinks it's a blade through them. The truth is it's ankle and knee injury.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Which figures. I have seen people with blades in them. It's not very nice. It doesn't happen very often, thank heavens.
Yeah.
The other thing that one always gave me a laugh was the advantages of the left-hand fencer over the right-hand fencer. And why do I laugh? Because when I was, shall we say, a lot younger, it was pool finals. And the pool finals were 8. This was foil fencing. So that made life interesting when there was me and one other that were right-handed. So you get so used to fencing left-handers, you suddenly meet the other guy and you go, got to change things around here. It's got to the point where I would fence and not even realise someone was left-handed because you just automatically change a set of tactics over.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's really an advantage to being left-handed or right-handed. It's just how well you know your game.
Yeah, just the unusual thing. Yeah, I had the same thing because I used to fence against a lot of left-handers, and a lot of left-handers, and also people who will just change, who are ambidextrous, so they change hands. Just it was one guy who he'd change hands mid-bout because he's like, one arm got tired, so he just switch and then use the other one. And I was like, it's a thing you just kind of get used to it.
Yes, the switching arms was banned long ago in fencing. The only excuse for switching arms was that injury prevented you from using your current weapon arm.
So you have to go into a competition and just basically pick an arm.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, interesting. Because yeah, like see, I was actually gonna ask you about that. 'Cause I'm like, so you just don't get switch hitters in fencing.
Yes, look, fencing is too. I don't know if you've tried it or not, but it's extremely difficult. I had an injury very early on in my in my 20s, and I was told by this brilliant doctor, "Oh, just don't use your right arm for a year, mate. You'll be right." So I switched to trying to fence left-handed. Now, at the end of the year, I had great blade work and I had great footwork. Only one problem: couldn't do both at the same time. It's very hard to coordinate. I know it can be done. Some years later, I met another bloke from Melbourne who had a similar problem. He had to change over permanently. He was making national finals in 2 years, so he was going well. But it's not an easy thing to do. So, and the other thing is, when you're trying to fence with a weapon in either hand, as you might have seen in some of the old days, it's also very hard not to get them tangled up.
Yeah, I'll tell you one short one. I mean, the psychology behind that is really interesting. I don't want to delve too much into like educational psychology, but yeah, like how like handedness is actually a measurable thing. Because I've like with students I've worked with in my job as an educator, not fencing students, and also as a student myself, I've done tests of like hand dexterity, and there are some people who are really close and go either way, and then there are other people where you are very very left-handed or very very right-handed, and so it's quite a variable thing. I think we should probably get back to Paul Wolfgang's question. We said we'd answer it a while back. And then
just one quick comment before that. The other thing you've got to worry about with handedness is that if you need the eye to be dominant on the same side as the hand, when they're cross dominance, you've really got a problem.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Comes up in shooting sports a lot.
Yeah, actually, because I remember like when I did archery, we were talking about that. Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so Wolfgang's gone in HEMA terms. Would there be an electronic way to remove an afterblow as a valid action? I don't know. That's a really hard one to answer because we're dealing with incredibly different. In HEMA terms, we'd be dealing with incredibly different weapons.
If you're talking about electronic scoring or not in HEMA.
Well, I think he's talking about electronic scoring in HEMA. So doing like using the same kinds of electronics that are used for like modern epee, modern saber, but with like long swords and
yes.
These things.
Yep.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I don't know. Like every argument I've seen about an afterblow, the argument's always based on what kinds of injury an action would cause. So if like the big one I've been involved in is if you hit someone in the arm, if someone attacks you and you hit them in the arm on the way in, would the injury done to the arm be sufficient that they wouldn't be able to injure you if their blow hit? Which obviously, because in HEMA we're not hurting each other, we're just like just whacking someone in the arm as they come in. Like there's no way of knowing that. I think it's a rules thing. In HEMA, there's like the afterblow discussion is, or the afterblow argument is a full-on argument. There are people who think that it's completely rubbish, that a blow will either disable someone or they won't, and if it's not going to disable someone, then it shouldn't be scored at all. It's sort of a thing. All right, so I've got some clarification of the question. Sorry, no, I was talking about the lockout time in sport. It's to remove afterblow. Basically, sport fencing has no afterblow due to electronic scoring. So basically, just what Wolfgang's asking is just so there's not after blow rules in sport fencing, which, I mean, near as I can tell, there's not. But yeah, like, I don't know. Is that like, was that a thing? Like, well, I guess the bigger question is, why were lockout times introduced in the first place? Like, why do they have them? What purpose do they serve?
Well, they really do serve to say the attack must have precedence over a counter-attack rather than a parry riposte. So it's how you want to view your sport, really, whether you want to pay the attack rather than the counter that's going to go into it to make that cut or point.
Yeah.
And you must have made some changes to allow for electrification of these things, because if you electrify the whole blade as you do in saber, that means you can sit with the flat of the blade and it'll still act as a cut.
Yeah. I've seen that. Yeah, no, it's yeah. Whereas like in HEMA, like edge alignment is a big edge alignment is really, really important. Like in competitions, blows with the flat don't score, because being hit by the flat of a sword is not very debilitating.
Well, this is what they did when to electrify the fencing saber. They had to let go of that, so you can never hit with the flat of the blade anywhere on the blade, and it'll register as a hit.
Wow!
Because how else can you electrify a cutting blade? So it's just the edge and the point that will ring. Technically, we're not there.
Yeah. Well, that would, I imagine that would have had a lot of would have really influenced how you defend as well. Because if you can hit with the flat, you could potentially reach around parries in a way that you can't when you need to deliver force in a cutting edge. So is that
that in the last Olympics?
Yeah.
When I noticed it was coming in, there was an attack came out. The saber arm was a little low, and there was a counter attack into that on the arm, and it came in flat. Rang.
The person scored?
You bet. So they're the sort of things that you have to look at in your own sport, what you're prepared to let go of for the sake of electronic scoring.
Yeah, you reckon it's always just going to be a trade-off.
Yep, it's going to be a trade-off.
Yeah,
It
wow.
certainly was. That was the way it went with electronic scoring in foil in Australia, because certainly when I was young, we had a lot of competitions that were not electric, and believe me, the judges' eyes at seeing where a hit landed weren't real good. In fact, in the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, the reason that FIE made it the first major competition to use electric scoring is because there were insufficient qualified judges in Australia to run the competition.
Oh, wow.
So the decision was made that we will let go some of these things to give us the surety of electronic scoring. But then of late we go to video refereeing anyway, just to make sure.
Yeah. It's just change. I mean, yeah, but it was just changing things as well. So,
yes.
Yeah.
You get two challenges. You've got to know when to use them. You've got to be pretty sure to pick them, or you're going to lose them. Or near the end of the bout, when you know it doesn't matter, you go for them anyway. Because if you've got to pause, then it gives you a chance to think what your tactics are going to be. Well, they're checking it, even though you know it's going to go against you.
So you can only challenge 2 times.
Yep, in the bout.
Wow. So, yeah, I can. Having seen tournaments run, I can understand why you'd want that. But that, I guess that also then means that people have are starting to try to game that system by going, okay, I've got these 2 challenges in reserve. When do I want to use them?
You look at the same thing in cricket. Look what they're doing there, the video referee and all the techniques they've got there. It becomes another instrument in the game.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, you see the same thing in just pretty much every sport. I guess it's kind of interesting for me from like a human sort of psychological perspective, because I see a lot of that stuff in professional sport where there is a payment like there's a payout on the line, and that payout can be, you know, in the millions. I mean, it's like was the the Floyd Mayweather versus Conor McGregor fight was one. You know, they got paid they each got paid millions of dollars just to turn up, like, you know, and then there was a win bonus, and yeah. So, but I find it's kind of interesting. So you're actually seeing the same sorts of things, like with, you know, fencing competitions. Which, so what's actually what's on the line when it comes to a fencing competition? Like, you know, are there cash prizes, or is it just, you know, it's just
Usually not.
Yeah,
it will affect your sponsorship. This does not apply to Australia, right? We're not talking about Australia when it comes to money to get that one, but internationally, yes, it can mean quite a lot, particularly in some of the Asian countries, and they don't mind spending money to win medals.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. There is. So in some, do you find then that actually the fact that in some countries there are fencers who are fencing with so much on the line then affects the way that, like, Australian fencers will have to fence basically just to be competitive? Like there's a knock-on effect.
Well, yeah. The trouble is, Australia is one of the few countries where we're still amateurs. Probably every other country in every Olympic sport is professional. That's your big problem. I mean, you know, if we got $100,000 nationally a year in sponsorship and support, we'd think we're in heaven. But one thing I can point you to would be China. China decided that they wanted to win the 2012 women's epee teams for gold medal prestige. So they approached one of the best coaches in the world, Daniel Levovisia, and they were prepared to pay him 600,000 euros each year for the 4-year contract, plus all his expenses paid as he travelled the world with his team. That's the sort of difference we're talking about.
Wow. Yeah. Sort of. Yeah, and you're going to see. Yeah, you're going to see a lot of that. So they're bringing in people basically. They're just. Wow.
And they still are.
Yeah. Wow. And do you find then that you're getting, like, is that leading to knock-on effects where the countries that either can't or don't do that for whatever reason are are also trying to step up their game, or they're changing what they do to just to remain competitive? Or is it a case of people are just like, all right, well, you know, let's forget about the Olympics, focus on, you know, competitions we can win?
Well, yes, in some respects you could do that. If you take Australia, for example, it's difficult because the powers that be consider that if you are in any contention for support, you need to contest things like world championships. And for us, that's quite stupid. They're so far above our level, it's not even funny, apart from some very few individuals that put their heads up every now and again that do well. In most cases, they spend considerable years overseas learning their trade. But for the average person or the average fencer in Australia, it doesn't mean a great deal. Because most of the people here, they're either school kids, or they're at uni, or they've just started work. There's all sorts of pressures on them. Their training times are quite limited. And you're going against people who are fencing training 6 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week. That's the difference.
Yeah, wow. So
it's a bit of a steep hill to climb. Especially the way we support sports in Australia, is that we put money towards the sports that are already succeeding, which to me is somewhat counterproductive if you think about it. But that's the way they do it.
Yeah, well, that's. I mean, I think that's kind of the problem in Australian society generally is, you know, they give support to the people who don't, like the people who've already made it, who definitionally don't need the support, or, you know, don't need as much. But okay, so and that then has a huge impact. And do you think that actually, because you were saying before that you can see changes in fencing styles even over the course of 10 years?
Yeah.
Do you think that, like, the level of competition, like, is it, if it's being run like a pro sport, is it being, you know, are you getting cases where, you know, that all of the pro teams are watching videos of the finals and, like, basically, you know, retraining everyone to sort of beat whatever won last year? Like, is it sort of, do you think there's a bit of that is going on as well?
With a few of the better coaches, yes, but unfortunately, I hope none of them are listening at the moment. Too many of them think that, well, I got my qualification, 20, 30 years back, and that's the way I'm still coaching.
Mm.
So no, they don't necessarily adapt. It's certainly some of the better ones do, and you'll see them changing all the time because the way the referees are interpreting the rules change, and so you need to be aware of those and be able to adapt to those changes. For instance, someone here said something. There's one Wolfgang has said, could you please touch on arm extension as the basis of the attack? This is the one thing in particular in fencing that referees keep changing. At one point, it was the point advancing to the target. This is foil, mind you. You could actually have your hand behind your back and you point the weapon in the air and you're stepping forward. It's considered an attack. Now, to me, that comes to the heading of totally stupid, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And then finally they decide, well, that's pretty stupid. But then people work out that if you had your hand and your weapon up in the air as if it was a saber and you kept moving forward, then you had the right of attack because you were advancing. So you were making an attack. And so the opposition had to do something to get around that problem. And then that was decided that was pretty damn stupid, which, let's face it, it was. And so now that when you start doing that, you take a couple of steps, it would be considered to be a preparation. So any attack coming into that would have right away. So there's a few changes for you just in one go.
Yeah.
That's weird. Saber, similarly, I can't say I'm as up on saber as I am on the other weapons because I never liked saber. Sorry, saber is one of those things you love or hate, and I'm in the latter group. But there's been considerable changes there as well in what constitutes an attack. For instance, you can't cross your feet in a forward movement. And in foil, again, you can't cross your feet the same and then hit. So you have to, if you're doing a flesh attack, you must hit before your feet cross. So there's some rules like that come up, and these sort of things change. Those have been around for some time.
Yeah, I've heard that one with saber, you can't cross your feet at all. Do you know what was the rationale behind those rules?
Because it was the set. People were on guard. The referee would say, "On guard, ready, LA, go," and they'd stick out their arms and they'd just charge each other. And one would say, "But I started first," and the other one would say, "No, I started first," and the referee's going, "Well," and it just became a spectacle. Just change. So they changed that, but then the Koreans came up with what they call the flunge, which is like a gigantic leap in the air, but the legs don't cross until after the cut has been completed. You would have seen that in the last Olympics, most likely, if you were watching saber. So there's been changes like that around to try and improve the looks of the sport. I mean, the thing is that the IOC always want to have a sport that is sold to the public well. And so some of these changes have been made purely for the sake of broadcasting rights.
Okay. So they're making rules as well as a way of trying to make fencing more sort of visually appealing. Yeah.
Someone made a comment here, and I can't see any. Oh yeah, there it is on the bottom. The visor was never a good idea, honestly. If that's talking about the mask with the visible section around the eyes, I'd have to completely agree. I've been in quite a few international competitions that we held in Australia, and the comments that came out from competitors that had to use them were not pretty. Because they're expensive, and okay, they're not supposed to break, but they were scratching so much that you had to constantly replace them. And then they found out that in the gap, in the interface between the plastic and the metal, blades were going through.
Yeah, because
they scrapped for that reason.
Yeah, I saw those, and I'm just like, yeah, that doesn't look. Wasn't the rationale behind that I guess going back to what we were saying before about making fencing more visual, better as a spectator sport, wasn't the rationale behind that was that the FA thought if you could see the fencers' faces, people would be more interested in sort of watching, or would be more emotionally engaged because they could actually see that it's a person fencing rather than just
That
a
was
big
that was that was the whole idea behind it. Yes, it wasn't a good one. So that got
Well,
changed for that reason. It was never a good idea. It was always crazy. In some ways, it was a bit like the first ideas they had of wireless scoring apparatus, and there were some real mistakes made in that first up. Obviously, it didn't change the way fencing was done, but it sure changed the attitude of fencers towards it, I can assure you.
because that was actually something I was very curious about. Because I see a lot of sports fencers complaining about wireless fencing, and I'm like, and to me, I'm like, well, wouldn't it be nicer to wouldn't it be easier if you didn't have to have a wire out the back, and you could just you could just sort of and also easier to train without having to have so much gear. So what happened with that, with the wireless fencing?
Well, there was quite a few people that brought out ideas about it. I remember seeing one in when was it? It would have been just after the Sydney Olympics. We had an FIE competition out here. It was held in the exhibition centre in Sydney, and they had this AM system. And I sort of thought of the idea and thought, it's not going to work. And I was talking to my brother-in-law, who was an electronics engineer, and he just laughed and said, there'd be so much signal bouncing around the place in there because of the metal, it will never work. But anyhow, we get out there, and they tried it out, and it was a total and utter failure. And we were on the armory team, and the DT said to the fencers, go over to the DT boys and they will carefully remove this stuff from them, and you'll be back to your ordinary mask. Well, we never removed one because they were so disgusted with the stuff, they'd ripped it out before they even got to us and chucked them in this huge pile on the ground. Did not work. But the latest stuff they use now, or we use it in our club constantly, it's because it's not a terribly large space that we've got. And the last thing you want is cords everywhere. So if you use a battery-operated wireless system, you get rid of all your cords. It's a lot safer, and we've never had any real trouble with them. And certainly now, as you probably would have seen the Olympics, they're used there constantly. But obviously a little more expensive stuff than what we use in the club. But it works very well.
Oh, yeah, that's positive. So it's the technology's sort of getting there.
Yeah, it just took a while, about 30 years.
Oh, well, yeah, 30 years. Yeah, seeing wireless technology back 30 years ago, wireless technology of before sort of routers and mobiles would not have been common. Yeah. So,
but their problem was one of the biggest objections they always had was, it'd be too easy to hack into. But it didn't seem to take them long to sort that one out, so they're not hackable into by anyone. And it's got to the point now with fencing technology where you just don't see cheating. It just can't happen.
So they've actually managed to eliminate a lot of the cheating. That's okay. So what sort of things happened? What sort of things were being done? How were people cheating before then?
Dear old Odichenko, the Russian fencer in the Olympics, I can't remember when, it was a long time back now. He managed to get a hit when his point wasn't very close to the target. And the referee was not very happy with that, so he confiscated the weapon, and the bout went on with the other one. Then that weapon was handed over to the armory, as the referee couldn't find anything wrong with it. And they looked at it, they couldn't find anything wrong with it until they took it apart. And then they found that there was a special wire running up through the grip and just coming out so you could see it on the grip itself. And if you had a little piece of wire mesh on your thumb, you touch it at the right time, and bingo, you close the circuit, and it records. Sorry, for those who aren't familiar with epee, there's two wires go up the blade, and the hit's scored simply by tip depressing and closing, making contact between the two and making a circuit, and that's what registers. And so what he was doing was short-circuiting that with his thumb and this little piece. That worked like a charm. That's probably the most common way that people would have cheated, was tricks like that. The other one was just having an exposed wire where it comes up to the connection in the epee itself, and again a piece of wire across the glove, and again just touch that. So in the armories these days, before weapons checks, the weapons have to be turned in and they're fully checked for all this stuff, as well as weights and flexibility, to make sure that everything's working. And before they're given back to the fencer. But before those fencers go on to the strip, there's another weapons pre-check where the body wires and weapons will again be checked by the armory staff, and then they go out. And so basically the fencer hasn't access to their equipment from the time it goes into pre-check until the time they're on the strip. So there's not much chance of them being able to sort something out there. With the changes from the bouting system, which I mentioned before, it was all 5-hit bouts all the way through in pools. Now that we've got the 15-hit direct elimination, there just isn't the opportunity. You have to win your elimination bout if you wish to proceed. Simple as that. So the chances of someone throwing one are now virtually gone.
Okay, so people were chucking fights, and people actually taking a dive. Yep. Wow.
Yes, that was. You won't find that anywhere in the record. That's from people who were there that I've spoken to. You don't talk about such things in writing. Yes. So these days it's very clean. The same goes for drugs. And drugs in sport, you hear about it all the time, but you know what it's like in your game as well. If you had a drug in you, your ability to perform would be going right down. It would not work at all.
In HEMA, I think drug. Well, I mean, HEMA has quite a strong pub culture as well. So we're all sort of out drinking the night before. Is probably the most common drug. But that's kind of an interesting one as well. Is you've got sort of performance enhancing drugs and and stuff like that. But so fencing now, they've managed to sort of do away with all the cheating. What kinds of effects do you think that's actually had on the practice of fencing? Or how much and I guess as an extension of that, how much is all those sort of extra things your opponent might have faulty equipment, or your opponent might try and game the rules a bit in this way, that way. How much do you think that's affected the technique or how you train fencers?
It hasn't really. I mean, that sort of activity was going on at the highest levels, so ordinary club fencing, it wouldn't have any impact at all. Even nationally, it had very little impact. The rules have been reasonably strict. Certainly in terms of drugs, you certainly would not want to be caught with a drug in you if you're a fencer, let's put it that way. The FIA rules are incredibly strict. A positive result will see you banned for a year.
Wow.
At the end of the year, you don't get to come back in. You then get to face a board and have to convince them that you're an improved guy and they should really let you back in.
Wow. When you say drug, do you mean
anything on the wider list?
Any what, sorry?
Anything on the wider list.
Okay, what's the wider list?
World Anti-Doping Association.
So and that, because that apparently doesn't that include recreational drugs? So if you got someone who's like marijuana, wow.
They include the lot. Yeah, anything that's on that list. Because most of them, in fact, all the Olympic sports really have to sign up to the agreement that they will follow WIDA's laws on drugs. So you've got no choice in it. So you can't afford to play it. But the thing is that while you might get an advantage in the furthest, strongest type sports, you're doping fencing.
Yeah, because I mean the injury rate is so the injury rate is low enough that wouldn't be big. So with baseball, the reason why they drug test for baseball players take drugs is because they get injured in training and they're taking steroids, but normal medical steroids that are used to help with muscle, help sort of repair muscles and stuff, or just help repair injury. They're not. It's not. Yeah.
You can get exemptions, of course, for medical reasons. So if you're in a situation where you need recovery, you can apply to your local local branch of WADA, right, the Australian mob, and with the doctor's certificates and everything, you can apply for exemption. And if they say it's for recovery, then you'll get that exemption.
So that's kind of bizarre. So the only reason you would have to take, or the only types of drugs you could actually take to enhance performance in fencing are things that would allow you to recover from injury faster, so you could train more, which you can get a medical exemption for. So all you need is a friendly GP and you're set.
Yeah, I haven't seen it done. I haven't even heard of it being done.
Yeah, well, it's been. That's imagine if if the injury rate is low enough. With injury recovery stuff, the main area I hear about it is in boxing and mixed martial arts, because the chances of being injured in training are reasonable. Reasonable because it's a sport about where you win by injuring the other person. Whereas in fencing, there's no, if you injure the other person in a fencing match, you get disqualified. So
the majority of injuries in fencing are knee and ankle injuries, where you've rolled something. So very rarely do you see anything else. I know of a couple of penetration injuries in Australia, which have been rather nasty, but fortunately they never did any terribly serious damage.
Okay, do you ever get concussions or anything like that from just being hit at the wrong time, or being hit, or someone lunging and hitting too hard?
I must have seen stars once or twice, but that's about as far as it's gone.
Okay.
That was back in the olden days, when the masks were a lot lighter grade metal than they are now, and it hit so hard just under my eye that actually pushed in, so you had the profile of the mesh just under my eye. When I took the mask off, you could see what it was like. That was a hard hit. But it's not like you fall down over. It was just, wow, your head's smashed back and you see stars, but you're all right. You continue on with a new mask.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. So just
fencing is considered to be the second safest sport.
Wow.
So that's pretty good. The safest sport, of course, is shooting.
It makes sense, because you're not
don't make mistakes with that.
Yeah, because you got sort of there's no risk of injury, and no, that's fair. That actually makes a lot of sense. I think it's kind of ironic that some of the safest sports you can do are combat sports. It's you've got you've got things like boxing and wrestling and stuff at one end, where there's really high, you will get injured because the goal of the sport is to injure someone. But then at the other end, you've got fencing and shooting, which are just incredibly safe. Do you think that actually affects the mentality of the people, or the mentality of fencers, how safe someone feels doing it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you're so used to doing it, that the chances of actually being damaged in any way seriously is infinitesimal. You just don't even consider it. You're going to get bruised, you're going to get a few cuts, but it's sort of the way it goes.
You get bruises and cuts doing office work, sort of thing. So yeah.
Well, nothing to talk about, really.
Okay, so I guess moving on. We've got a comment from Wolfgang where he said someone got a broken rib from a guard punch. I imagine that does happen. Actually, as one of the manuals I work from suggests that if you're facing someone who's a bit too aggressive, the solution to that is just to punch them in your face with your guard when they surge in on you, and that'll teach them to be a bit more restrained. But,
well, in fencing, that'll get you banned for at least 3 months and possibly a year. There are much more subtler ways of doing it where you don't get caught.
Yeah. Actually, it's been what happens. So in sport fencing, what happens if someone gets too close? If you're getting sort of body contact, or if someone just comes surging in.
Well, the comment is corps à corps, the French, body to body. If the referee sees that you touched, you can't use the weapons, the halt's immediately called. And the perpetrator of it can receive a warning card.
Okay, so if someone is seen to initiate that, then that's a foul.
Yes, but if you were to smash someone in the body or the face with a guard, you'd be automatically disqualified from the competition, and say possibly for up to a year.
Yeah, so you got to be careful. Okay, so it's sort of in some HEMA competitions and stuff, we have well, kind of the opposite thing where like you get a halt will be called if you get to if bodies are touching, because like falling, being thrown is, especially if you don't have if you don't have a padded floor, it's incredibly dangerous. Yeah, so but what that means is that people, if you're getting close and one person doesn't feel confident in close, what they'll do is they'll immediately grab onto the other person to call stop. Which I think it's kind of interesting. So do you think that the reason why it's a foul is basically to stop that from happening in sport fencing?
Yeah, I mean, the normal way of stopping something that they're coming in close is you simply turn sideways and go past them. So as soon as you pass, the referee's going to call ball.
Okay, yeah.
That's the easiest way out of the situation. So there's no need to do much more than that. There's some license given, it's the last Olympics, when particularly in foil, when someone comes in too close, they have sort of put their arm around them and sort of turned around. So they're trying to make sure that there's no damage done, so that's allowable. But if there's any intention in it, and you talked before about the broken ribs from a card punch, I do not see how that could be done unintentionally. I think that has to be intentional. As I said, there are other ways. I mean, if someone likes to flesh and sort of go into you as you come past, what you do is you go to preem and you leave your pommel in position, you lock your arm in position at their head height and let them run straight into it. If your hand moves forward, it's intentional. If it's there, I parried. Seems reasonable.
It works, I guess that's kind of it.
There are other ways. I mean, a gentleman I know many years ago, he was Australian Epee champion in his time, as a big left-hander. And his son was too tough with him. His response was simple. With his thumb on the inside, so his hand's in pronation, he would deliver this colossal smash with a point to your ear. And he wouldn't care if he got the hit or not. He would say, "This is the law, you don't do that again." So there are other ways of expressing yourself. I remember one gentleman I had, loose term, he liked to remise through your parry, and he was very, very hard, one of the early German fencers. And apparently he'd been dusting up a few people like this, so her fencing master asked to come to this other club so we could fence him. He tried it on me. So I took the low line parry, he pressured against my blade, so I seated down in pronation, so my thumb's on the inside of my body, and that left my point about 3 inches from his chest, and so I just extended straight up as hard as I could.
Just bang straight
and
in.
Guess what? He never tried that trick on me again. I also got the hit.
Nice.
So there are other ways that you can do these things legally if you have to, but I mean, rarely does this sort of situation occur. It might happen once in 5 years or something. It's that rare.
Yeah, because imagine that, given the nature of at least foils and epees, it'd be different with saber, but you'd actually there'd be a big motivation to not come too close so that your weapon doesn't get choked up. What happened? Yeah.
I mean, clearly, the better you keep distance, the better, because this is what you was coached for, I guess. It's much easier and smaller to disengage around a blade than it has to go around the guard and the elbow. So if you really want to push through an attack, you need to do it from a reasonable distance. Otherwise, you're just making hard work for yourself.
Yeah, and then do you find then that there's this kind of there's this balancing act between wanting to accelerate, so wanting to come in, wanting to sort of build up speed to come in quickly, and then also not wanting to build up so much speed that you can't stop before you get too close?
Yeah, it's all down to tactics. What's your assumption of what the opposition is going to do? How soon can you change that tactic if you're coming forward? Or if they're coming forward hard, is your opposition going to step into you? That's the other thing that can happen. So they're the sort of things you have to factor in as to what you're going to do. If you look at the current Olympics, in foil in particular, there's quite a bit of stepping in. There never used to be stepping in when removing the body from the target area, which goes back to the Gripper, I think, was teaching that stuff way back in 1600 something. But there's nothing new in fencing. It just keeps going around.
It's sort of in cycles. Yeah, no, it's
very much so.
Yeah.
Because I've been in it so long, I keep seeing the cycles. It's really quite funny watching it go around. We discovered something new. Yeah, well, actually, they were doing that 100 and something years ago. Don't let it worry you. It's just something that's come up, and the change of rules or whatever, or the fact that it was used for so long, they'll bring it up.
Yeah.
For instance, years ago, it was quite common to attack in foil in the low line. Quite common. It was a good attack. And it went out of favour to the point where some years ago I was watching one of our upcoming young lads in the state couldn't handle it. A gentleman who was attacking in the low line, he didn't know how to parry it.
Wow.
Because it's just gone that far out of fashion that no one attacked in the low line. And now I now see things reversed, and now people again doing it. So yeah, things like that just keep going up and down in tactics.
Oh yeah, like the sort of I think it's something they call it, in esports they call it the meta. The tactics change. There's a tactical change which causes a complete change to the technique. Yeah, that's interesting. Is there any so if there's kind of this constant change in terms of the tactics, is there ever if there's sort of a cycle, like it's cyclical? Is there ever been any effort to go, okay, well, let's look at documentation and let's look at what's happened. Let's look at how the cycle progresses and just always, and just try to work to always be ahead of the curve? Or is it sort of, is it a case of people still just constantly trying to reinvent the wheel?
Unfortunately, a lot of them just keep going round and round. Some of the better coaches, particularly overseas, you'll see it, they will keep up with it. They don't need to go back to the old documents because they've already read them and they know them.
Yeah.
If you look at some of these fencers, again in the last Olympics, some of the stuff they do in the early rounds, you just it looked lousy, it looked wide, and it was wild. But I noticed as that particular fencer progressed up the ranks in the competition, the fencing got better and better. So I think what it comes down to is they actually teach everyone good technique and cover it all. But then that fencer will pull out what they think they need in a particular situation to use. So if they can go light and easy in early rounds, they will. Again, an FIE competition in Sydney some years back, I had to laugh at one particular coach. He was so happy. His girl had gone against the current world champion and she'd got 13 hits on her. Fantastic. However, I've watched that bout and I can tell you what happened. The world champion got 3 hits in front and just went for doubles and sat back and didn't put any effort into it whatsoever because she was saving her energy for the next rounds. So you've got to be aware of what people are doing, and that's how a fencer of that quality anyway can certainly change their techniques.
Okay, well, yeah, because there's sort of that, there's that, looking at the competition as a whole kind of thing. It's not just match tactics.
Yeah, you got to pace it, particularly with a large competition. Even if you get exemptions from the earlier rounds and you go into the 32, that's still a few rounds you've got to go through. And remember, the most important about your fence is going to be your last one. So hopefully the final. So you really got to keep yourself fit for it.
Yeah, you want to conserve your energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. It's actually I had something really similar to that from a guy who does armored fighting. There's a sort of growing sport of basically recreated sort of medieval tournaments, in the full armor and stuff, and they have the same sort of mentality where it's okay, let's preserve our, who do we put on, what do we, how hard do we go in this in this round, and how much we're going to preserve our energy for the next round, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, you have to do that.
Yeah, wow. Oh, that's cool. So, and do you find it's sort of when people are training or when people are doing that, they also they have things that they do between matches to kind of make sure they're in good fighting shape?
Yeah, everyone's different. one thing we found out years ago, we didn't need sports science to show us, eating bananas is a very good move. I can't give you any technical reason for it, but I've seen kids come off after having fenced hard in the first round and their hands are shaking. They're really uptight. You stuff a banana into them, and no longer are they shaking. They're feeling a lot better. So obviously there's something in bananas that actually helps. But try it for yourself. Some people don't like bananas and will refuse to touch them. Others say it doesn't help me, but the majority of people seem to find that it does.
Okay.
But otherwise, I've seen kids walking around with earphones stuck in, listening to their favourite music. It calms them down. I've seen others walk around outside and kick walls and generally carry on. All for me. What I did was I just talked about anything but fencing. I know others want to watch fencing and see how it's going. I never did. I didn't want to see it. Kept right away from it. And I'd talk to anyone about anything until I had to get up and perform. So it's very individual really as to how you conduct yourself between bouts.
Yeah, kind of how you preserve yourself. Okay, yeah, interesting.
I should just say, one of the funny ones, again, an FIA competition, he was epee this time, and Canadian girl made it into she just won a semi-final bout. And we found her behind the final strip, cross-legged on the ground, taking her epee tip apart. And so, of course, the good armory guys are saying, we can do that for you. No, I'm doing this. And she very quietly sat down there, took the tip apart, checked the springs, checked the weights, fixed them, put it all back together again. And apparently that's what she did to calm herself down.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Kind of. Well, and that makes sense as like just kind of a simple repetitive task. Like a mechanical task. Yeah, and a lot of people do stuff like that. Like, you see people who say knitting helps their anxiety. I guess it's kind of the same sort of thing.
Oh, I should add that she went on to win her final bout, and that gave her the world championship for the year.
Yeah. Well, so it obviously worked.
It worked.
Yeah, wow. So that's interesting. So do you see? So you see like a lot of little things like that. Do you also see sort of, have you seen changes in terms of sports science, in terms of just general fitness equipment? Like, does modern sports shoes make a difference? Like just general sort of like fitness knowledge, is that or the sort of the gear that people can get, has that made a huge difference?
Oh, yeah, it's an interesting one. Back when I was a lad, again, you were using sand shoes because that was the best thing you could get. And the fencing shoes that you get now have they're more comfortable. They possibly give you better support in the heel than the others do. I guess they prevent some injury. But otherwise they don't seem to make much difference in what's going on.
I can see it. So there's not as big a difference. So I guess sort of, in HEMA we kind of have the argument between, should we all be doing this in period shoes, or or is it okay to wear like modern sports shoes and stuff like that? And that sort of goes back and forth. But
there's one difference. The fencing shoe, if you look at it, has got a very thin sole. And the reason being, when you're lunging, you do not want your back foot to turn, because that's how you get injuries to your ankles. If you're wearing shoes that have a higher sole than that, or a heel as some of these other sports or your boots possibly have, then there's a chance that you can do yourself an injury in the ankle by lunging in those. So if it was me in your sport, I would be wearing fencing shoes or a sand shoe of some sort, but certainly something with flat, not high.
Yeah.
Sole.
Yeah. Well, actually, something I found was a couple of years ago. I was doing like a display at a steampunk event, and so I rocked up to the event in costume, and then I just took off anything breakable, chucked my gear on top of my costume, and started fencing. But that meant I was fencing a pair of combat boots, so boots with like sort of a heel a bit up, like a heel that's like a little bit less off the ground. And I found that I couldn't lunge. Like I could lunge, like my lunges were really, really short. And about halfway through the demonstration, I actually completely switched up my footwork. I ended up doing basically boxing footwork, where the heel doesn't touch the ground. It's very sort of short, like quick, short steps, a lot of lateral movement. Because I found that I couldn't, I found that lunging it just didn't work. I couldn't lunge the way I normally lunged when, because normally I train in just a pair of cons, so just very thin sole, very flat foot, like very flat sole as well. And that was something I found really, really interesting. Because you do through history, you see depictions of people fencing, and you see there's example from the 1700s, 1700s French small sword, where where the lunges are all done with the back heel lifted completely off the ground.
Yes, and the toe pointing forward, not sideways.
Yeah, which I find kind of interesting. I don't know, just sort of heel height, I guess, I find that interesting, just how that affects it. So.
Well, you got to remember that when you're lunging, you need a good anchorage point for your foot to push off against. And if your shoe stops you from doing that, then yes, you'll have the problems you just talked about.
Yeah.
So you need a decent foot coverage. But there again, if you do look at those ancient manuals, I mean, I'm thinking of Angelo's English stuff, if you're familiar with those. If you look at the positions that they have, they're much closer together than we would fence today. And they're often, when they parry, instead of stepping back, they take their weight on the back foot, rear back, and they often have their wrist bent when they come on guard. So it's a cocked wrist. Oops, there's a camera.
Oh, like when you're in
that position. Cocked there, rather than flat. Yeah, you're doing better than I am. So there's a lot of differences between then and now that have come up in the intervening 150, more than nearly 200 years. And that's the thing, is that they could probably use their boots there. Though I do remember reading in one text from there, they were saying, if unsure of your footing, such as on grass in your duel, take your shoes off and fence barefoot.
Wow.
So there's a bit of that. I don't know if you've come across that one, but there's quite a bit around like that as well.
I know Jules Jacob talks about this, where he's he reckons you can't lunge in a duel like you can in the cell, because most duels he reckons happens on grass, and having fenced both on grass and on flat surfaces and just any surface I can, you can't. Actually did another show fight I did, this was a medieval fair. I was wearing not proper medieval shoes, but modern reproductions that have they're just they're about 5 mil of leather thick as a sole, which isn't actually what medieval shoes were like. Medieval shoes were a thinner leather. They're basically like a leather sock. But we're on rec grass, and my first lunge, I didn't lift my front foot enough, and so I lunged completely backwards.
Yes, drop lunge.
I've
done the same thing on grass myself in demonstrations, wearing fencing shoes. Many years ago, and after that, I've refused to go anywhere near grass. Dangerous stuff. But that's a difference, because in those days they weren't as athletic in what they were doing. They weren't pushing a lunge out as hard, because there again, when you're facing a sharp weapon, you're probably a little timid about how far you're going to push your lunge. I think because of that, what you're doing now in boots, you're probably trying to do a modern lunge in that style. It might not work so well.
Yeah, well, depending on which of the three Angelos, the final Angelo, Henry Charles Angelo, is in his manual. He says a lunge. He says your stance should be 2 foot widths, or you should be 2 foot widths between your feet, and then when you lunge, there should be 4 foot widths. But it's like a very, very short, sharp lunge.
Yes.
Although that saber, the other thing is, this thing is heavy enough that the leg, and also committed enough that you don't start near as far away. Like if you start as far away as you do in modern Olympic sabre, you're just giving your opponent a very, very long time to see what's coming.
Yes.
So you start closer for that reason as well. Whereas modern fencing, and particularly modern sabre, where you don't have to worry about edge alignment. Parries I think are less reliable. So you're primarily defending with distance, which I think is a bit of a difference. I suspect as well, like a lot of people back in the 19th century were actually fencing on grass because, at least in Britain, a big thing with fencing was turning it into, or sportification didn't start with competition. Sportification started with leisure. Basically, the first Henry Angelo worked out that you could sell if you sold fencing as a game that people could play, more people would do it, because preparation for the duel wasn't as good a motivation for people to do, to take up fencing as just, this is a lot of fun. There's actually, I think there are accounts of Prince Albert, like Queen Victoria's husband, actually fencing on the, just fencing with his friends on the greens. I think there's actually, I think it was in The Crown, it's one of the recent dramas about the royals. There's actually a depiction of it where, Albert is out just fencing with a mate on grass. I think that's, I always kind of suspected that's really affected how long people can lunge.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. And what I was trying to say before, and I probably didn't put it clearly, is that I think that the way the lunge is executed now in sport, in my sport, is totally different to what it was back then.
Oh, definitely.
And I think that if you're trying to use a modern lunge in your sport, you might get yourself into trouble.
Yeah, very, very, very possibly. Well, I mean, there are a lot of people who do both successfully. So, yeah, we'll see. But no, I think it is kind of interesting, I guess, in terms of the technical changes, just how that happened as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's different lengths of lunges now for each weapon. So you're changing it up all the time. So, in foil, you expect that the lunge will go with the front knee is usually over the toes. In epee, it's over the ankle. And in sabre, the stance is so much wider that it's different again.
Oh, wow. So actually, there is specifically differences between how you lunge for each weapon.
Yeah. Especially in terms of the length of the lunge. That's the main thing, because you think of it in epee, you don't want to commit yourself too far, because if you're overextended and you can't recover, there's only one answer to that: you're going to get hit. It's as simple as that. And in foil, you need to be able to get back out as fast as you can go. In sabre, because of the changes in stance and footwork, you're still doing you're trying to do an even longer lunge. So that quite often you see them, the knee will be not back over the heel, it'll be actually further back. So they're really pushed it around as far as they can go. To try and get the extra length.
Yeah, well, so they're just doing the longest lunge possible.
Yeah.
Okay, do you know what motivated that? Or?
Well, it's just that the rules have caused it, because they can't flesh, they can't cross their legs, they've got to get distance somehow.
Okay, so they're lunging longer.
And you think of the nature of sabre, if you've made your attack and you missed or you parried, you're going to get hit. There's no way in the world you're going to recover from it anyway, no matter what length of lunge you use. So you might as well go for the one that gives you the longest possible lunge, even if you can't recover from it.
Okay, wow. So yeah, just interesting. And so you just basically try and put everything in the lunge. Do you find that also affects the blade work? People start to do more feints or more kind of deceptive attacks in the hopes of like just to absolutely minimize the chance of being parried?
If you asked me a couple of years ago, I'd say yes. But looking at the way they're fencing in the Olympics at the moment, the answer is no. That's how fast things can change.
Wow.
I was quite surprised that the foil now, as well as in still, it's always been in sabre, I guess, but there's just so much more of counter-attack now than there is in parry riposte than there ever used to be. I mean, foil used to always be taught, step back with a parry. These days, it's step in or step sideways and counter. So you can mix them up, you can use both, and so your opponent never knows whether you're going to go back with a parry or whether you're going to step in. So that adds sort of another dimension to the whole technical game of how you're going to judge what your opponent is going to do. It's like the old story that the novice fencer always asks you. You might have the same thing. What do I look at when I come on guard? Have you had that one?
What do I look at? Yeah, I think I had it once. Someone's like, what should I be looking at? And I'm just, my answer was just just look at the middle of the person, try and keep everything in your peripheral vision. But
yeah, that's pretty much true. You've got to look at the whole thing. Though some people want you to concentrate on one, because if you look at the way movements go, for instance, if someone is going to come forward, the front foot moving forward doesn't mean anything. It's the back foot that counts. So you've got to see what the back foot is up to. Is the back foot coming forward or not? If the back foot's not coming forward, then they're just playing with you. And so you don't react to it, because that's what they're doing. By moving their front foot forward, they're trying to get a reaction from you to get the opening. But you don't react to that because they can't hit you if they're only coming forward their front foot. Watch the back foot. If the back foot starts to move, they're going. So you have to respond. And the same thing when you're going to make a parry. Do you take a full step back, or you just go back with your back foot? And leave your front foot there, which is that bit of extra space to make the parry, and leaves you in good range to make your riposte or counter-attack, whichever it might be. So you have to have a look at all of that, know where you're going straight away.
Wow. So okay, and that's kind of, I guess, is that also to deal with the speed of the weapon, where you just looking at the weapon is pointless, so you might as well just you have to look at what the body is doing to actually try and work out where your opponent's going to be.
Yeah, it's the hand that will give things away in the movement, not the blade. I mean, the blade can move so fast. Let's face it, the blade moves, or it can move at just subsonic speeds. It's really moving fast. So really what you're looking at is body position and hand position there. So what's the hand going to do? Is it coming forward? Is it going backwards? Is it going to make a move, like change parry positions or take a counter parry? So you've got to look for that, and you're looking at the guard for that. It's one of the things that you teach. My student has to decide, has to do a compound attack. Now, I present my blade, they have to feint, and I'm going to take one or two parries. They have to see which parry I'm taking and do the appropriate disengagement to hit. So you're not anticipating what's going on. And you do that by watching the position of the guard. For instance, if I go to take if I'm in the sixth position, I go to take counter six, my hand and my point will go down first, and then up and around to make the parry. So as soon as you see it start to go down, you know it's going to be a counter parry. But if the point and the hand start to come across, you don't going to parry on the cart side, and you disengage underneath instead of over, which you have to do with the counter parry. So that's what you're watching for.
Yeah, just looking for those hand movements to get there.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you would do the same with those sabres, but at possibly a slightly slower pace by looking at the size of the sabre blade.
Oh yeah, well it's actually a thing. So because I also do 19th century epee, but I'm holding off until I can get proper contact lenses, because I find if I don't have my glasses on, I can't see an epee blade or like a foil blade properly. Whereas like with this thing, and this is relatively small by the standards of 19th century saber blades.
Is it a Hutton?
Yeah, this is Hanway Hutton. So
yeah, thought it was from the look of it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so that I find with saber and anything bigger than that, I can see it fine. But yeah, it's just I have incredible, like, just with having sort of slightly poor eyesight, I have incredible trouble doing any kind of really fine weapon.
Yes, that makes sense. And of course, 19th century epee is not all that different to what it is today. And the weapon itself is basically the same, and the use hasn't changed much. Of course, in dueling, it's a bit different. I suppose you've seen the YouTube video of a 1912 duel.
Yeah, is that the one? I've seen actually a few where they
it's quite an interesting one, really.
Yeah, they're both poking at the arm.
Yeah, that's how epee duels are going to go. It's interesting that in well, you've probably seen this. I'm talking converted, I suppose. Duels in France, in Paris, in the park. There's sometimes 300 duels a weekend out there. The average duel length in time is 10 seconds. So don't believe what you see on TV.
Yeah,
so that one I'm talking about, that on YouTube, it lasts, I've got a hard time, it's between 8 and 10 seconds. I think that's probably realistic of what was occurring back in the 19th century.
Oh yeah, I mean, so we've got descriptions of duels, and it's just like, it's like 2-3 actions. I mean, the only ones that go longer are ones where, are ones where there's sort of an injury, and then, or there's an injury, and then the other person's like, no, I'm not, that's not sufficient. We have to keep going. And then, like the first recorded, or the first emancipated duel, which is a specific duel between women, started as an argument over flower arranging, I believe, although with that there was almost a second duel, because after the first exchange, one woman got a very light injury on the arm, and they kept going. They went back for a second time, and the second time the other woman got quite a serious stab wound to the shoulder. At which point the whole thing was resolved, because no one would let the seconds, and the supervisor wouldn't let it continue. But that then led to an argument. Over who had won the duel, the person who got in first blood or the person who got the best hit. And especially because this was obviously a new type of duel, there's no rules. What ultimately resolved the argument was the woman who was supervising the whole thing, who was, I think, she was the only female surgeon in France at the time, had said that in order to prevent infection, the duelists should be topless, which also meant that no men could be around. And some men who had escorted the women there heard the argument started, got worried, or reportedly got worried, and so had come to see what was going on. At which point, the surgeon who was supervising saw these men coming, and immediately ran and attacked them with her umbrella, because she thought they were coming to leer at the duels.
Cane fighting, yes.
So it's.
But that does make sense. A gentleman I knew years ago involved in theatrical fencing, I suppose the best way of putting it. Always use sharp weapons. And the reason was, they were saying, well, we've tried it the other way, and the trouble is that when you get a penetration with an ordinary fencing weapon, bits of it remain inside. Now, there has been accidents years back with epee penetrating the body. And when the gentleman went to hospital, they were fishing out screws and springs and God knows what else from the wound, and bits of clothing. So if that wasn't done properly, then yes, you could be in trouble. In 1937, I think it was, in Queensland, there was a backyard sabre bout between brothers, and unfortunately the blade broke and one of them got run through in the body. Taken to hospital, they sort of looked in and said, no, there's nothing wrong with you, mate, she'll be right, off you go. Sort of stuck a band-aid on it, back he went. When he collapsed 3 days later, I took him back in hospital. He had a collapsed lung, and they were pulling out bits of clothing and whatnot from him. Unfortunately, he died. But yes, each case of penetration there has been clothing and bits and pieces put into the wound. So the surgeon saying topless is probably a pretty smart idea ahead of her time. Or maybe they were more used to penetration injuries back then than we are now.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think. Yeah, and also, I mean, there's also the risk of infection, like before or back then before modern sort of showers and washing machines and stuff, where clothing is not as clean. Clothing sitting in a wound was could also risk infection apparently. So yeah, no, makes sense, but kind of yeah, still kind of bizarre. Dueling as a practice seems quite strange to us today.
It's not that long ago it was banned, though, is it? It was 1852 in Australia and 1854 in England. So quite recent, but there was very few duels fought. I've only ever found the case of one or two duels in Australia. The one I mentioned previously, I think was a major one. And in England, they were pretty all pistol duels, but the old saying, if you want to kill your man, you go to a sword. If you just want some self-respect, you use a pistol.
There's actually there's research into that, and based on the records we have, pistol duels were a lot less, resulted in injury or death a lot less of the time.
Yes, quite a lot been written on that, but the statistics are there. You can see the number of duels fought with pistols and deaths compared with sword wounds. Crazy stuff. I'd have thought intuitively that a pistol was far more dangerous, but no.
Yeah, no. No. Yeah. Well, if you don't hit with it, I think that was the logic. Because there was a case where a guy, he was socially pressured into a duel in England in early 1800s, and he on religious grounds said that he thought dueling was a backwards practice, and so he just told everyone, I'm just gonna rock up, I'm just gonna fire my gun into the air, I'm not even going to point it at the other person because I don't think that we should be killing each other in duels. And unfortunately, his opponent didn't agree and shot him.
Yes, I remember that one. Yes, it wasn't a good look on his part. I killed him, if I remember rightly.
Yeah. No, I think that's something I've always kind of wondered about as well. Because in Britain, sword duels disappeared. Sword duels were very, very rare.
Yeah.
It was mostly pistol. Whereas on the continent it was much more varied, and then as you go through the 19th century you get the French dueling sort of declined in France, and then after the Franco-Prussian War they really, really got into it, which is why you've got most of the film footage you see of dueling is from France. And then you've got Italy, in Italy and also in the Germany, dueling was quite popular. It was quite important sort of middle class activity. The weirdest one I think is you ever heard of the German sort of academic fencing?
Yeah, Slager.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently they are reasonably sharp, but very light blades. But they just basically stand in distance and swing each other until some
stupid stuff. In Italy, they were doing those sabers similar to the Hutton one. Italian dueling sabers were in use until Mussolini banned dueling in his reign. So that was in the 1930s when they banned it there.
Wow. So there was still dueling even into the 30s.
Yeah. He stopped it because he was losing too many of his army officers. But he was a very good saber himself. Yeah,
it was because it was a big thing for with Mussolini in particular. Mussolini is very, very style over substance as a politician. So being seen out and being fencing and stuff was was really, really big for him. I think it was because there's actually there's images and stuff of Mussolini fencing. I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was quite a few of the big generals did. Patton in the US was another one. He was the fencing champion of his year in the Army College, whatever they call it these days.
Yeah, wasn't that the same Patton who actually wrote the last US Army Sword Manual?
That's right. Yes, he wrote that one.
Yeah,
they took on something similar to the Australian Light Cavalry saber, the straight blade and the large D guard. The American saber at that point was similar design. In fact, when you see them side by side, they're actually hard to pick apart.
Yeah, really similar. Because his idea was basically that, as far as he was concerned, you wanted something that was basically like a sword that was basically a lance but shorter, because as far as he was concerned, you're never going to stand and actually like spar with your opponent. You're just going to ride in and stab them and ride off.
Well, that's why you got the change of design of saber from a curved blade to a straight blade, because you could kill someone with a straight bladed saber with one movement, where with a curved one and a cut it takes you two. Therefore, it's faster to do it with a straight blade.
Yeah, and you see, actually, like even going back quite a long way, you see, there's the cavalry, like the British cavalry drill, where they basically all they do is they stand, and then they the idea is you just sort of lean and bring your point on line to just counter hit the other person.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah. So it's much faster. I mean, this is how modern fencing goes. I mean, you're looking at the number of movements it takes to make a hit. And a straight extension with a point is always going to beat someone who has to bring their hand back up and around to make a cut.
Yeah.
And I remember there was one classic hit in the Olympics that I just saw there, where a bloke come forward with his head up in the air, and there was a counter attack with a point, and then jump back. So there's only one light up. There was no question of who got the hit on that one. That was a classic. So saber can be used that way as well.
Yeah, Australia. Well, actually, that's a really interesting thing with 19th century saber. The British saber has like the way of cutting is very direct. It's a very direct attack. Like you basically just extend. And this is something like even people in sources like in manuals talk about, like Richard Burton in his manual complains that the British are always doing these direct straight attacks, whereas he much prefers the kind of the whipping attacks that the French were doing. But British saber was always very, very sportive. Like single stick was a really popular sport throughout the empire, and then going back before the 19th century, it was a proper spectator sport. Like people would go and bloody up their faces playing with sticks.
1 inch of blood must run on the head.
Yeah. And there's sort of and also the other. What I find really interesting is they have the other arm tied to a scarf that runs between the legs.
Yes.
Which apparently what the reason for that was that they didn't want to stop people from using the offhand to cover, but what they did want to stop them from doing was running in and wrestling, and then basically getting control of the other person and beating. Which is interesting change. But British stuff was always more like sport. British saber was is basically a combat sport going back till at least starting with at least with Henry VIII, basically removing the ban on fencing schools within city limits. And then so I think it's kind of interesting that whereas in continental saber, French saber was always a military thing. It was like very much fencing masters taught it, but and obviously fencing enthusiasts probably did it as well. But other than that, the only people who really did it were soldiers. Whereas foil was really common. And so you see similar things, sort of all throughout Europe, where saber, and all of these styles, like Italian saber was meant to be like serious dueling business and serious military business. And all of these really serious business saber systems have much, much bigger cuts. I find that really kind of interesting. Like, is that sort of, I don't know, I always kind of wonder if that's that is a direct influence on, of it being a sport.
Yeah, it's possible. As far as the duel goes, I think it was because to be able to use an edged or a pointed weapon well, it takes a lot of years of training. Using a pistol doesn't take anywhere near as much. I think that had something to do with it as well. I think that the sword, or the art of the sword, has always been far more ingrained in the European psyche than in the British. I'm not quite sure why, but that one might be lost in time, but I think that's the case.
I think it's because the most common fencing in Britain for a very, very long time was done by working class people, whereas in the continent, like in France up until the revolution, unless you're an aristocrat, you weren't allowed to wear a sword in public. So I think it was it's like a social status kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah.
Yes, times have changed a bit, haven't they? I don't know what your sport's like, but fencing these days, if you get a competition, try and find somebody who hasn't got at least 1 degree. Good luck to you.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, HEMA's very much the same. I think. HEMA has a very big academic component as well in terms of the historical research, but
yes,
yeah, I guess. Yeah, still kind of similar. Cool. So sort of.
They both had one thing in common. You've both got to be prepared to be out there by yourself on your own merit. You do not have a team to hide behind. And that takes a certain sort of person to do it, I think.
Yeah, true. It was probably the appeal of sort of individual sports as well, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, when I was recruiting kids, I always found that the best recruits were the kids who were very good intellectually, usually had very good marks at school, but never played sport and did their best to avoid it. They were the ones I found made the best fences. With a few exceptions, of course, but very few.
Yeah. Yeah,
I remember one girl I've been teaching her for some time. She was the captain of the under-15 New South Wales foil team, right? And she showed me her school report. And, it's just A's. E? What the heck happened there? Oh, it was just PE. How could you have got an E in PE? She said, it's simple. It's dumb. I don't want to do it. I never took my uniform to school. I used to sit out under a tree with my friends and talk. That's the sort of thing that you get.
Yeah, HEMA is exactly the same. We're all just a bunch of nerds. Yeah, no, I think it's actually a while back there was some, I've heard of some schools actually trying to bring in fencing or bring in HEMA because they've realized, they've recognized that the people who do it are the people who don't try and be. So
yeah, because it suits all types. Years ago, when the skills program was working at Newington College, I was talking to the people there, and the chap in charge of fencing, he was saying one of the reasons they brought it in was because of their Asian students, because so many of the sports used to be just rugby union, and their bodies, the Asian body just wasn't built for the big tough union stuff. They needed another sport these guys could get involved into, so they started up fencing, and they had hundreds of kids involved. Huge. And that was a fair enough reason for it too. I don't know how they're going these days, because from what I've seen, some of these Asian people can be rather large and rather tough. And so,
yeah,
I mean, we had a Chinese coach out here at our club a couple of years back. He just dropped in to visit. He'd been teaching national stuff in Beijing, so he's pretty good. But he was about 6'6". He was a big boy.
Yeah, you see it. Yeah. And that's
he was a very good coach.
Yeah. Well, you see it, I guess also sort of with fencing, I guess there's probably a bit of early on if you're tall and you're starting out, you've got a little bit of advantage. There's probably a bit of bit of selection pressure there as well. But
I hear coaches saying, "Oh, you've got to have the right height for this. You've got to do that." I think it's a load of rubbish. If you look at the women's foil in the Olympics, if you saw that, Lee Kiefer won it. Lee Kiefer is 5'4". So she claims. Others say it's 5'2". I don't know. Go for the middle and say 5'3". But either way, she's not very tall.
Yeah, she's just somewhat stuck with it. Also, actually, I mean, that's the thing I've seen teaching HEMA is early on, and as a tall person, I recognize this, the taller people have a bit of advantage, and then as the skill level goes up, that those kind of, I guess, biological advantages start to become less and less significant. Is that something you find with sport fencing as well, or is it more?
Oh, definitely. I can think of one person immediately, I won't mention names, that fit that very tall person, did very well on all the underage stuff, but once he hit sort of the 20 mark, they were all doing him because by then they knew how to fence, and he was still working because he'd been able to use his height all the time as an advantage. He never really learned how to fence properly. And so when the others came up and did, they'll just beat him every time. So that's what happens, and you see that. And that was a really outstanding one, but you can see quite a lot of that in the clubs as well.
Yeah, no, it's a thing. So like, I mean, I was part of a HEMA club for a while, like everyone was my height. Like I was, there was like 2 people there that were shorter than me, and then everyone else was either my height or taller, and I'm 6'4". Because like all the beginners would come in, try to fence and get like, and basically they go, oh well, I keep getting beaten by tall people, so I'm obviously not tall enough for this. And then we got a guy who was, I think he's not short, but he's like 5'10" or something, came in, who was really good. And then the demographics changed, because I was like, oh, actually no, you can't. You just have to kind of get over that initial hurdle of height.
Yeah. You teach them second intention fencing. You teach them to step in at the appropriate times, and they all come together and they start to work quite well. Or even the flesh attack will work if it's done properly.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, flesh is an interest like that. I mean, as an attack, that's an interesting one as well, because I'm pretty sure flesh, that's a 20th century innovation. Like that's a technique that I mean, I've never seen it in an English language fencing manual. But yeah, like I don't know if is that something. Do you know about when that technique originated, or is it?
I couldn't tell you on that one, but yes, it would definitely have been in the 1900s. It would not have been earlier than that, because you just think about it. If you're practicing basically for the duel, would you try a trick like that in the duel? The answer is you'd want your head read. There's no way. It's a sport movement. I suspect that, I think I first encountered it in the 1960s. I'd say it was probably just post World War II would be my best guess at that one.
Yeah, when it comes in. Yeah, no, it'd be interesting. Yeah, probably. Yeah, but definitely very much a sporting thing. Yeah. Although weirdly enough, I have seen it, well, in a different sporting context. There's a guy runs a YouTube channel called Sensei Seth, who he's a kickboxer and karate guy, but he did a bunch of fencing, and he reckoned the fletch was the most transferable technique, because what you could do is you could throw a punch from longer range, and then as long as you didn't lose your footing on the way in,
then accelerate it.
Yeah, you accelerate, and then you can come in and actually grab the person.
Yeah. And come in with your fist first into their chin. Yeah.
Pardon?
Yes.
Yeah. It'd be interesting.
Well, it's been done. I mean, if you look at Bruce Lee, he picked up a lot from fencing when he did it. You look at his footwork, and a lot of it's fencing footwork that he used.
There's a footage. Well, it's even like his punching stuff. Like there's like one video of him actually sparring at a martial arts demonstration, and a lot of people have said this guy looks like a fencer who's taken up kickboxing.
Yeah.
Like it obviously had a really huge impact on him.
Oh, you see it in his tactics. I mean, from the little I've seen and read of him, his favourite trick was a attack and preparation. Instant the other person started to move, he went for him. And it was a typical epee move. Hey, I see a movement, bang, I'm going for it. Except he'd do it with a boot to the side of the head or something like that. But you'd see him do it. Okay, it was obviously choreographed in his movies, but I think it was probably part of his normal technique. That's what he would do.
Yeah. Well, actually, because I've heard accounts of that, and like I said, there is a video of him sparring. I think he's sparring Dan in a Santo, and yeah, he actually does that.
Yeah.
He does it when he spars as well. But yeah, that was his big thing for ages.
I think there's a lot of crosses and things that can be done from one sport to the other, even if one is done with a hand and one's done with a weapon. There's still common, certainly in terms of tactics.
Yeah, Because what's interesting is in unarmed martial arts, attacking with the lead hand, like the jab, is something that most martial arts around the world recognize as having adopted from Western boxing, and it seems, based on what records we have, it seems to be mostly something that was developed in Britain with boxing and then exported from there. Like most traditional martial arts in other parts of the world, the front hand is used for defense and the backhand is used for offense. And the theory is that it's actually an adaptation of a fencing lunge. So the idea is that someone just goes, oh, well, I'm going to actually get on camera. But someone, they're doing that traditional kind of, I'm going to use one hand for defense, one hand for attack. And then someone just goes, oh, if I do the same movement as a fencing lunge, I can just punch the other person in the face. And so there's sort of a theory that that's where it kind of, even back then there was a lot of cross-pollination between sort of fencing and boxing, which is kind of cool.
Oh, it makes sense. I mean, even when you watch kickboxing or some of these other sports, a lot of those tactics are terribly similar. You can see what's coming. Watching, what is it? Biquitas was his name? I can't remember. The kickboxer from many years back. He never lost a bout. And you watch what he would do in a match, and he would do what Lee was doing. The instant the other guy moved, he was counterattacking wherever he could. And if you look at Muhammad Ali, what he did, he would use it. The defences are called a second intention attack. He'd fool him into thinking he's attacking one way, then the next thing you know, something else has crumped him from the other side. He did that regularly, and they kept falling for it. I couldn't believe how stupid they were. You could see what he was going to do. At least I could, and I never boxed in my life, but I could see what was coming.
Yeah,
and they were copping it. And he never had anything to do with fencing, but it's just to say the commonality of the two in terms of technique. It's got to be there.
Yeah, sort of just that kind of like that convergent evolution of what makes strength, what makes sense, because it makes sense in both. Both are going to sort of develop it independently. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you look, yes, I'm just thinking the other thing is the differences in things. If you look back to the early days of fencing, the early manuscripts, you'll find that rather than parrying with the blade, people were moving the body out of the way because it was faster to move the body than the blade. And then technology came along and lightened blades, and suddenly it became easier to move the blade than the body. But you still see some people now going back to that old technique of moving the body. Certainly in this last Olympics, it was there. Now, I don't know if you use that in Hema, whether you can move the body out of the way faster than the blade. I suppose it depends on the weapon you're using. That huge broadsword you pulled up a while ago, I'd think it'd be faster to move your body than to try and parry the thing.
I actually find the opposite. I find getting head and body movement to work with like these sorts of weapons, as your primary defense is very difficult. You're much better off parrying, because in the same, as much as the weapon is slower, it's stronger, so I can just put it on a line, and I also, so long as I control distance right and I control my angles right, I know exactly where my opponent's going to be. Whereas if I want to defend by movement, that's a lot riskier because of the length of the weapon, and the only way to reduce that risk is to pull myself really, really far away, which means that I'm never going to riposte because I'm too far away to riposte. So yeah, it's kind of a cyclical thing, because you get when you've got short weapons, really short weapons, then moving, defending through movement makes more sense. And then as the weapons get longer, defending through movement starts to get riskier and riskier. But because they're longer and heavier, they're more predictable, so parrying becomes more useful. And then, I think as weapons get lighter again, defending through movement gets a lot easier. I can remember I was looking at modern saber, of just the small amount of sort of sport fencing I've done. I know, so compared to what I do with 19th century saber, people who do modern saber defend through movement a lot. They do a lot more defense through movement. or just controlling distance. Whereas, like you go back to, back about, back sort of, 100, 150 years or so, like all defenses, pretty much all defenses parries, with there's the occasional sort of use of slips moving back to supplement a parry, and then actually defending with movement is very rare. And then, you go back another sort of 100, 200 years, and then you see more kind of defense through movement, but still primarily, you're covering yourself with the weapon. And then when you get into shields and that, you just use the shield. That's what it's there for.
Well, considering too the role of technology there with the modern saber fencing, the blade's flexible. So if you parry it, it can, if the distance is right, actually whip around the guard, still make a hit. But I like to see you do that with that saber you had in your hand a while ago. I don't think that blade's very flexible.
It bends from top pressure only,
not sideways.
Yeah, sideways bending, a little, but it's not.
Nah,
and
it's
not going to flex.
That's why the parrying by distances come into play a great deal. Gets away from that problem of the flexible blade.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So they're moving back to make the defense safer and then coming back forward.
Yeah.
Wow.
If you're in close and you stick your hand up to take an ordinary saber parry, there's a good chance it's going to bend around that guard and still catch you on the arm.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Not much fun. So again, the coach has to change the coaching again, because instead of making the parry and the riposte, you've got to say, okay, you've got to move back, but not so far that you can't come back with a riposte, which makes life interesting.
Yeah. So how do you, if you're doing that, like if you're backing off, how do you change directions really quickly? Like, do you have to then coach that as well?
Yep, you do.
Right, so what do you tell people to do?
Footwork training is now something that sports science brought up. And so, the old ladders on the ground, there'll be all the footwork technique with that, which is teaching your kids how to change direction fast. And they're just ordinary exercises as well, just changing direction rapidly, as fast as you can. And you've got to do it. And it has to do with core body strength as much as anything else. And so overall, you've got to build up fitness. Okay, so just got to keep just working on your conditioning and stuff and doing some of the agility ladders. And they work. If you look at the some of the FIE website, they've got videos up on that, and some of them, they took a challenge up for some of their top fencers to do physical gym stuff against some of these top gym boys, who's going to be the best. In each case, the top fencer came out on top very easily. They're extremely fit.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
And so the speed is incredible. Foot speed now is really incredible compared with what it was. I mean, when I was a kid, fencing was relatively static. You pretty much stood there and you did your movements and you finished with a lunge or whatever. But these days, as you can see in the Olympics, the foot speed is quite incredible, and they're constantly on the move. They're never still, always moving.
Okay, just constantly, and then which I imagine would also change the tactics as well. Well,
yes, it does.
Yeah.
And what I saw in this Olympics is that certainly in the earlier rounds, probably up until the quarterfinals, there was much wider movements involved, and they're much simpler movements. It was only in the last part there where the movements became much more complex. I was quite surprised. A lot of it was direct attack based on speed and distance, rather than I can outsmart you by going around your blade.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, well, I guess if you're fast enough, if you're fast enough to make those movements, if you're emphasizing speed, direct attacks make more sense. Like, you wouldn't want too much complicated blade movement.
Well, you only use it when you have to. It's as simple as that. If you hit them direct attack, why wouldn't you? But as they get better and their speed matches yours, then you have to start pulling out or dig into the technical toolbox to see what you got to make a hit.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the other big changes. Of course, in the old days, in this type of fencing, you only had to worry about 5 hits. So you had 5 good attacks. You're probably right. These days, with 15 hit bouts, you need 15 good hits. So you've got to be able to do a lot more now than you had to back then.
Yeah. So like have just more tricks up your sleeve kind of thing. Yeah. No,
so what's sense. The hammer practice? Is it 5 hits or 15 or 10 or what do you do?
Whatever. It's not. There's no standardization. My club, we just bout continuously for depending either or if we've rented out a place where we've got limited time, it'll either be between 1 and 3 minutes, depending on who's fencing. So, like depending on the fitness of the fencer. If I'm meeting up with friends in the park, we just go until we decide that we want to stop. But yeah, like we don't do limit exchanges. And then even when you get into tournaments where there are specific rules, I mean, he was a bit weird in that not only there's not standard rules, there's a lot of resistance to standardization. Not from the typical perspective of, everyone wants their rules to become the standard rules. But there's a lot of people who don't think you should standardize rules, because if you standardize the rule set, then people are going to start training to optimize, training to win the rule set rather than training what's what's in the manuals or what's historical.
That's true.
Yeah, which although that's also
you have put rules in place already on some things, haven't you?
Oh yeah, there's
So you are limiting.
Yeah. There's actually there's a huge diversity of rules. So there's not even standard scoring systems. Every club has safety rules, or most clubs have safety rules. But what those aren't standard. So the old saw club, you're only allowed to grapple if you're on if we've got a padded floor and you've done normal wrestling with the person, so you're used to enough that you're not going to have a bad fall. Whereas there are other clubs where someone can walk in off the street and grapple on a hard surface. Depends, and that's actually the same in tournaments. There are some tournaments where you're allowed to wrestle, other tournaments where they call stop when there's body contact. There are different rules around hit strength. So most tournaments have rules around that you have that you can ignore a hit if it's too soft. Some club and a lot of clubs are now saying, actually, we need to also we also need to tell people off for hitting too hard, because particularly with longsword, people are getting concussions. In terms of even safety stuff, in terms of practices, if there's some clubs have supervisors to call a stop if they think anything dangerous is happening, other clubs don't. Every club has rules, and every tournament has rules, but they're completely non-uniform. And there's at least in terms of scoring in tournaments, there's actually a lot of resistance to standardizing it, to the point where some people have even suggested with tournaments that or adopting practices like having a different scoring system each tournament and not telling the competitors how you score, or alternatively, you have a way of randomizing the scoring system between each bout. So there are some bouts where you win by scoring multiple hits. There are some where it's just, it's first touch. There are some where it's, you need 2 hits to a limb, but only 1 to the head or torso, and actually specifically randomizing it. on the assumption that like whatever people have to train that is an average of all of this will be, will be good fencing in the hypothetical term, which I do actually have a huge problem with, because I think that, well, we're seeing over the course of the 20th century how much rules changes affect, the fencing. Like, you change the lockout time, and all of a sudden a flick is a lot less effective. There's always been tournaments and rules. Like, most 19th century fencing manuals have rules for how to do a fencing match, and which focus primarily on scoring. They're not that uncommon in 18th century fencing manuals. You go back as far as the Middle Ages. Like, tournaments were hugely important to knights and to the knightly class. And they all had different rules and scoring. Actually, the earliest we have for how tournaments were conducted is not a rules document, because the rules were all sort of sorted out orally back then, because most people couldn't read, or not very well. But the first document it's a book that was written that this knight who travelled around Europe competing in tournaments would send ahead of him to the people hosting the tournament, and it's a series of questions. It's a series of questions that he asks every tournament master, and a number of them are about, like, okay, how does this tournament scored? What does in this sort of situation, who would win? There's also a bunch about, like, basically pertain to theft. So if I steal if my squire steals an enemy knight's horse, does the squire get to keep it? Do I get to keep it, or does it have to go back? Sort of stuff. So it's like, prizes are also very much on his mind. But
yes,
yeah, it's
interesting how it goes.
Yeah,
I think Hutton, in his old sword ways and old sword days, actually says something about that too.
Yeah,
he did that document.
Yeah, it's not old sword play. It's Fencing Through the Ages. He talks about that.
Oh, that one, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's Hutton. Like, I did a thesis on Hutton, and I still keep finding stuff that, and I gathered together a huge archive of documents, and stuff I've seen, like stuff I haven't seen, just turns up all the time. Like, the guy was really prolific.
Look, I should ask you something. It probably isn't the right venue for it, but I will anyway. Are you aware of Malcolm Fair in England?
Yes, I am.
You are, right? Okay, well, don't need to go on any further.
Yeah, no, I've actually when I was writing my thesis, I actually had some email correspondence with him, which was really helpful. So yeah,
because he's got a brilliant library on a lot of this stuff now.
Yeah, he does. Unfortunately, not a lot of it is digitized, which made me very sad.
No. Yes, well, that's what happens. But yes, I agree. Those manuscripts need to be digitized to make them available.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, because he's got stuff that just is really, really rare. Like, he's actually he ended up with a whole bunch. I know he ended up with a whole bunch of like Hutton's notes. Apparently, he's got all of Hutton's scrapbooks.
Yes.
Which is so. Hopefully, well, one of the dreams, I guess, would be to get access, to go over England, just spend how long accessing all of that.
Yes, now you have to go to England and visit him to get access.
Yeah,
which is not that easy, particularly at the moment.
No, particularly at the moment.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to. That's sort of a non sequitur to most people, but I just thought I should mention that in case you weren't aware of him. But as you are, that's good.
Yeah, it's good. Well, and like for anyone who wants to Google Malcolm Fair, or look up, it's the British Fencing Museum, I think it's called.
The Sword. Fencing magazine. He's been the editor for a long time. You can still contact him through the Sword.
Cool. Yeah, no, I think
British Fencing Association.
No, definitely anyone who's interested in the history of this stuff definitely should look him up. Cool. So I just noticed we're getting towards sort of the time we need to finish up. So just quickly check with the audience if anyone has any more questions, post them in the chat, and we'll sort of finish those up quickly. But otherwise, Richard, do you have any sort of final thoughts or final comments?
Yeah, there's just one thing I'd put up. It's about women in fencing. I mentioned this before. I dug this out, and it's quite intriguing. When these weapons were first introduced in Olympic Games, foil individual, men, 1896, first games. Women, 1924. Foil teams, men, 1904. Women, 1960. Epee, individual, men, 1900. Women, 1996. Teams, men, 1908. Women, 1996. Sabre, individual, men, 1896. Women, 2004. Teams, men, 1908. Women, 2008. Does that tell you something about society and cultural change?
I think so, yeah. It's terrifying how, like, the 1990s.
Didn't think that one, did you?
Yeah, no, I thought...
Unreal.
Yeah, that's incredible, because, like there are records of women fencing going back ages,
Yeah.
like Hutton talks about it. And then
women were only allowed to fence before hits because they weren't strong enough to do 5. It was only 5 came in the later after the 1960s, and now they fence 15 hits.
Wow.
15 hits, or the system is 15 hits. It's 3 lots of 3 with a minute break in between. So somehow along the line, women must have got a lot stronger. Either that or men's perception changed. I guess it's the latter. Pathetic when you look at it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, sort of. Sorry, just going to go with that. In 2008, was it Team Sabre 2008?
Yep. Yeah, we're talking about ancient history here.
Yeah,
16 years ago. I mean, that's long ago.
Yeah, that. I mean, that just seems incredible because,
well, it's ridiculous the way we've treated women in the sport.
Yeah.
And that's what I say. It's a cultural change, as I spoke to you before. And culture has been a major change in how the sport of fencing has gone since 1900. And some of it is totally ridiculous. And that is one of them. I could never understand it, but that's the way it was. And it's only now that we have equality.
Yeah, well, I mean, good that we got there, but still just an amazingly long time.
Yeah, unless you've done a study on this, you wouldn't have picked up those times. There's no way.
Yeah, well, so I don't know. I honestly don't know that much about 20th century fencing. But yeah, because this is the thing that really surprised me, though. It's not there were, in the 19th century, there were reference to women fencers.
Yes.
They just weren't allowed to compete.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say modern Olympics, 1896 start, and 24 years later, the women get into it. Where the men got in right at the ground floor in 1896. So they had been fencing before in clubs and, of course, in world championships that were run by the FIA, but not in the Olympic movement, which is obviously a little more slow, shall we say, in getting started. The one that amazed me, of course, was Epee. I mean, 1996.
Yeah.
To me, that was crazy.
Yeah.
And women were fencing Epee in clubs and in nationals long before that. But it took them that long to get round to it. Sabre is even worse.
Yeah,
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know what justification there was for holding it back so long.
I think it's because Sabre was always seen as a military weapon, and so I think it's we all know it's not a physical thing. It's it's an emotional thing on the part of the men doing it. Is they don't want to. They don't want to let women use the weapon that they think makes them more big and manly.
Tell you something funny on that one. In the fencing world, Sabrers always reckon they're the big tough boys and they're the ones who are doing everything wrong and getting caught up, blah, blah, blah. Someone actually did some research into this, and it's actually men's foils that are the worst. They're the ones who challenge referees and jump up and down and spit and carry on and whatever. It's not the Sabrers at all.
Yeah.
So that's another myth dispelled.
Yeah, wow.
But I agree. I think you're right in terms of the mythology of it. I think that the Sabro men thought it was probably too much for the poor little woman to do. Where in fact, the broadsword aspect of sabre went in by 1896 it was pretty much gone. It was a lighter weapon from there on in. There's no reason why a woman couldn't wield it.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing though, like in terms of broadswords though, in HEMA there are plenty of women who do broadsword. I think in Australia, like in terms of like national competitions, there's women have won national broadsword competitions. I know of at least one instance where it happened. Like once happens because I was watching it, but I'm pretty sure it's happened a few other times. Like it doesn't, even with a heavier sword, it doesn't really seem. It's not a physical impediment. It just. It's actually in HEMA we see in HEMA being essentially, perhaps ironically, a much more modern sport, like much more recent sport, in terms of the competitions. Open competitions around the world are quite common, like just, and like women competing against men, compete against men quite effectively. Like it doesn't really seem to matter. But yeah, I think it's just a cultural thing,
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's a big macho thing. We're tougher than the little women. They can't do this. Where in fact the little women are more than adequate at doing it.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of having to get round to admitting it. And that seems to be one of the problems in society, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, you're seeing that in all sorts. In a lot of sports. I think the most interesting one was Holly Holm. I think at this point former UFC champion, so really dangerous fighter. And like she was a champion boxer. The reason she got into doing mixed martial arts is because women's she couldn't. There just wasn't enough paid gigs in women's boxing. So she switched to, again, a much more modern sport. And not only became a champion, but she was the first person to beat Ronda Rousey, who had been up until that point had just dominated the sport.
Seen that bout. It was tactics on her part, from what I remember that bout, because Rousey wanted to grapple and come in, and the other woman, whose name I've forgotten, made sure that didn't happen and was boxing her and keeping her at a distance. So she worked on Rousey's weaknesses and did her on that.
Yeah.
It was just common sense and good tactics.
Yeah, it was the thing. It was and because up until that point, Ronda Rousey of the fights of championships she won a huge portion of them through armbar. She'd up until that point had been able to pick how she was going to win, and then probably because people started taking women's mixed martial arts seriously, all of a sudden the quality of competitors improved, and all of a sudden you got someone who's like, someone's like, I know how to deal with this, and
and did effectively. And I've seen that in women's cricket. When women's cricket first started up in the T20s, they had the areas roped in because the poor little women couldn't hit a ball that far. But now they're professionals. These women are now hitting them over the boundary fence and into the stands, the same as the men. And so it has to do with ability and a chance to perform, rather than anything inherent in a weakness of a female. It doesn't work. And that's what these sports come up with. And I'm sorry that fencing took so long to actually wake up to that and to get onto it. But at least now, with equal medals and everything in the Olympics and equal time, it's for this sport, it's going quite well.
Yeah, no, that's really, really positive that you sort of getting that recognition. So is there any suggestion or any move towards open competitions? Because it's still as far as I can tell, it's still men's and women's. But
no, I think it will stay that way. I've been in competitions where I've fenced women, some of the better ones in the country, and back in those days, they certainly lacked the speed and the stamina you needed to compete. Now, I haven't watched Lee win the Olympics. I'm not so sure that still holds.
Yeah.
But maybe it's got to the point where it doesn't. But I think there's also, in some respects, there's been a problem with insurance as well, with mixed competitions. And I don't know how that stands.
Yeah, well, yeah, that'd be interesting. And also, especially like international level. I mean, like you see, I mean, actually, this is the thing we're seeing with a lot of sports is you get like women's competitions, and then the performance gaps start to narrow. Probably because, like you're saying, like it's the Holly Holm thing, where just the sport gets big enough that they can actually you can actually invest in finding and training high level athletes, whereas before then it's sort of you get like occasionally people who are naturally talented, or I mean, actually with women's mixed martial arts, the reason Ronda Rousey was such a high level athlete earlier than everyone else was because she was an Olympian, but before she was an Olympic judo competitor, so she got the benefit of like being trained for the Olympic team. But so we'll see. It'll be interesting. I'll be interested to sort of see how it goes forward. I mean, certainly in HEMO, there are a lot of open competitions. I guess, and there are, and it's not. It's probably about as common as women competing is women win these things. So we'll see how we go, but it'll be interesting to see how it how it sort of develops going forward.
Well, the other thing you've got to consider is at the moment you've got gold medals in Olympics and World Championships for both men and women. Combine them, and you've done away with one. So when you look at it that way, probably not going to happen.
Yeah, fair. Yeah,
the amount of competitions that you've got, you'd cut the fencing program in half. I don't think they're going to do that.
Yeah, fair. You were saying before as well, like there's a point where the Chinese really invested in winning. They were looking at sports they reckon they had a shot at. One of them was women's foil, and they're just like, oh, well,
epee.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, women's epee. Yeah, and they invested the money in it, and they got it. But if you've got full-time professional athletes, you can train them up, particularly over a long period. You get those. If you look at the really successful fencers, male or female, most of them started when they're around 5 or 6 years old. The object is by the time they're under, let's say, the time they're 17, their technique should be perfect, and from then on in, the training is really just on maintaining that and on tactics. And so when you pay money to get a coach like Daniel Everwusia, he's got those people when they've already got the technique there because they've been at it for so long, and all he's doing is he's teaching tactics. Yeah,
just and like the perfection of that tactics. Yeah, and that's it's probably also, and like actually I've heard that from people who do like South Korean style fencing, and it's very much just once you've got the technique down, it's all about like just really like getting laser focus on perfecting the tactics. There's a cultural aspect to that as well, where in Korea, they fixate on just perfecting, absolutely perfecting how to do a certain thing. Like you hear about esports, a lot of the Korean esports teams, they'll, if they're playing competitive Counter-Strike, so first person shooter, they will memorize the scatter pattern of the pixels that represent shotgun blasts, so that they can shoot. They can accurately shoot with absolute precision, which takes an incredible amount of practice. But I guess if you apply that to fencing, you'd need someone who's got sort of who's got that technique down.
Well, you look at any of these top-level fencers in the FIE these days from any country, and they've got it down perfectly. Whether they choose to, as I said before, they probably won't use it all in the earlier rounds. They'll go the easy way. But when they need to, it's there, and they can use it. And that's a crunch.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's the thing. And, I mean, it's interesting in HEMA, obviously, nowhere near as competitive, but there's a noticeable difference between people who started when I did, which is like 15, 16 years ago, when it was still, like, HEMA was still fairly new and kind of still evolving, and people who are like even just 10 years younger who started in university and have been doing it for 5, 6 years, and just like, and I will say, like, the quality of the fencing and the speed at which the speed at which they reach that quality is much, much better, which is a good sign. But it's really interesting, sort of just the difference that creates.
Yep, it will. It gives them that much more experience and that much more technique. And of course, the other thing is, you've got to remember, the older you get, the slower you're going to get. Can't avoid it, unfortunately. It's the way it is.
Just got to stave off the inevitable and hope for the best.
Well, yeah, and in fencing, there's seniors, and then there's the next step up, veterans, and that starts at about 40 these days.
Oh, wow. So what are the age categories?
Oh, crikey. I can't even remember half of them these days. Some are under 7s, under 8s, under 10s, under 14s, under 18, under 20, under 23, and just so it goes. I think it's a bit overboard, and perhaps internationally it's worthwhile, but in Australia I've always found that quite often the younger ones are still succeeding in the Opens quite nicely. I remember one gentleman I was working with, he was 21, so he was still under 23s, but he was also the Australian national champion for Opens. And I can think of other instances further back that just go on like that. So who knows? And on the other hand, I've known one woman in particular who can win Opens and then front for veterans and win that at national level.
Wow, good on her.
Yes, that's a good effort, I reckon.
Yeah, that's really impressive. Yeah, you'd have to have your technique down. Yeah.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that's coming to the end of our time. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's really interesting kind of to fill in a gap about, I guess for me, like a gap in sort of my knowledge in the history of fencing, which is ironically very recent. Thank you again. Really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to chat with us. And hopefully sort of post-COVID, we'll actually be able to sort of fence in person and stuff, which will be good.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim. I appreciate it. Yes, when you get back, I wouldn't mind visiting your club just to see how it operates.
Yeah, well, definitely. Yeah,
thank you.
Come say hi, and vice versa. We'll see if we can come say hi to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Excellent. All right, cool. For those who normally come to these, we normally do a Zoom chat afterwards, but unfortunately I can't do that today because I have to now go clean my house for a house inspection. But we will be back on Wednesday evening where we'll be looking at longsword. So hopefully see a few people then.